Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? A little while ago, I backed a Kickstarter. Every once in a while, like I'll see a Kickstarter, I'll say, I wonder if I should back this or not back this, or am I interested? I saw this one and I was like, oh yeah, I got to back it. When does it come up? Leagues of Cthulhu. So we just got fulfillment in PDF. We're waiting for hard copy, I think. I think you can buy this PDF now. This is 96 pages of pure RPG goodness. Paul Wiggy Wade Williams knocked it out of the park. This is a phenomenal RPG product. And I'm not saying that just as a Ubiquity or Triple Ace Games fanboy. This is superb. Now, in order to play this, you do need Leagues of Adventure. You do need Leagues of Gothic Horror. This is not something I'm normally a fan of, but I'm going to make this a notable exception because this is that good. And Leagues of Adventure, pretty good. This is 1890. It's Victorian era world. It's the Age of Adventure, and it's billed as like steam pulp role playing. It's got some steampunk in there. You can use as much or as little of that as you want to. It's up to you. And also, Leagues of Gothic Horror expands on that, and that's the fiction of the time. This is emulating things like the Frankenstein, the Dracula, the mummies, the werewolves, the black magic, all that kind of stuff. This does a great job of emulating that. And they have a lot of supplements, most of which are on my shelf back there because I really like what they've done with that game. I like that sort of horror. I like that sort of feel. However, I really like Lovecraft. It's something I got introduced to as a kid, as a teenager. My grandmother had a boarder in her house, and I'd heard of Lovecraft, but he had At the Mountains of Madness and Other Tales, a little slim volume of some of Lovecraft's works. And then he had an August Derleth book, a bunch of little short stories. So I was introduced to both kind of sides of the mythos, the original tales, the cosmic horror, and kind of like, what would boil down to like you against the mythos. And I've certainly played games where we interjected the you against the mythos. And we fought kind of Lovecraftian horrors. Ran away from some, but you could fight a bunch of them. This is not that game. This game emulates the original feel of the Lovecraft stories, where what happens to the main characters? They go insane or die, or both. Usually both. So this it does a great job at emulating that original stripped down, pared down mythos. And it even talks in the first chapter. Well, what kind of mythos are we talking here? And he's interjected some elements from some of the stories of the other authors, even authors like Howard. Another thing, he made clear too is eliminating some of the negative parts of Lovecraft stories. So any of the implicit racism, that's just not in here. It's not part of this game, which is really cool. But keeping the mythos really pure. And then jumping right into like what does this game do? I don't want to give too many spoilers away or anything like that. But he's got an elder lore skill, and if you haven't guessed, this is knowledge of all that forbidden stuff that you get by reading those forbidden texts. You read the Necronomicon, you read the King in Yellow, you read the Narcotic manuscripts, and you start to learn things you wish you hadn't learned. If only I hadn't read that accursed book. And he emulates the feel of that in a couple ways. The first thing is that you can't really take very many. You can only put so many points in that skill, and that sort of emulates the idea that you think about it, the characters in those stories, even the ones that spend a long time researching this stuff. They kind of knew some of the stuff. They were able to decipher some of the names of the places and of some of the deities and some of these unspeakable rituals. But after a while, it was just too much. They couldn't absorb that much. And if you learn too much, heck, if you're one of the guys that wrote one of those books, well, generally you died horribly or were devoured by invisible creatures in the middle of the street. So it also emulates the fiction because it's a two-edged sword. The more elder lore you gain, the more crazy you become. You lose points of sanity permanently by gaining elder lore. So it's you can learn stuff, but at a terrible, terrible cost. You start to become unhinged, just like the people in the tales do, which is really, really cool. Introduces some new talents, some new archetypes, some new leagues, stuff that's straight out of the fiction. It really gives you the feel of the fiction. Introduces bloodlines, and I don't want to give too much, but the idea that keep in mind, this game, and I'm going to return to this vibe over and over again, this game is happening in 1890. Lovecraft stories were written, they're supposed to happen around 1920 to 1937. You could be a member of one of these families mentioned in these stories. So, just think about it for a second. What would it mean to be a Marsh? Okay, I don't have to say any more. But yeah, that's an option. You can be, and there's advantages, and it's clearly there's some disadvantages to being a Marsh. So that's a really neat addition. To this. He also talks about ritual magic. It goes over the new types of magic and rituals that you'd encounter in this game, and they all emulate the Lovecraft flavor. Some of them replace the rituals in Leagues of Gothic Horror. Leagues of Gothic Horror, like this, there's no magic in Leagues of Adventure. Leagues of Gothic Horror introduce the whole magic system, and it's ritual magic, and emulating that kind of fiction. There aren't those sort of they're not wizards. They're not the people that just shoot fireballs out of their fingers and can cast a spell instantaneously. It's a big, complicated ritual that emulates that sort of fiction. Leagues of Cthulhu, the ritual magic is kind of expanded. And if you look at those tales, nobody cast some kind of spell and summoned Yog-Sothoth. It was this big, complicated ritual. And sometimes the rituals, the more people you had involved, like you're dancing around in the middle of a Louisiana swamp, well, you're going to have more success. And this captures brilliantly in a mechanical way that feel. So, I'm reading all these rituals and reading all this stuff, and it's like, this is awesome because I recognize them out of the stories, and I also recognize how mechanically that he's able to make this stuff come to life. So, I mean, really, it's one of those things where I'm just like, wow, he did a phenomenal job with that. There's all kinds of books listed, and they're the books you would think of. I already named some of them, the whole Necronomicon family. And they are, detailed in terms of like what kind of ritual they contain, what kind of horror rating they have. Like just you read this book, you have to make a sanity roll because you're starting to go bananas. You've read some things you wish you hadn't read, and how many eldritch experience points you can gain, which will can increase your elder lore. So yeah, not a good idea to read those books, but they are available now. Really cool thing, already mentioned. You're playing in 1890. You're playing 30 to 40 some odd years before these stories were actually written. So you are free to ignore the canon of the Lovecraft mythos, meaning that all those stories haven't happened yet. However, these locations, they're still there. The city of the Elder Things in Antarctica, that's still there. But Lake and Pavity's expedition hasn't gone there yet. So maybe you're the people that ended up going there in 1890. It's awesome. So he presents a whole bunch of locations, throughout the entire world, what those locations are like, and also what's going on in that location right now. And a lot of this is I can see this is interpreted from what was mentioned in those stories, and then gives adventure seeds. So maybe you find a message in a bottle from one of the expeditions that went to the Antarctic, before 1890. And maybe somebody saw those mountains. So maybe you're a member of a league that discovers that, and now you're going to take a trek down there. And it goes on and on with all sorts of other locations, the swamp in Louisiana, out of Call of Cthulhu, etc. I don't have to name all the locations. There's a whole bunch in there, and I don't want to give too many spoilers. But each location he gives this great adventure seed for like how you could get involved with that, at what that place would have looked like 30 to 40 years prior to the story being written, which is like just incredibly exciting and awesome. Trying not to gush, but this is really good. Not only provide the locations, but the cults, the organizations, and the people. And where would they have been? Because there's all kinds of characters mentioned in the stories. Maybe not the main characters of the stories. Like Charles Dexter Ward might not be alive yet, but the guys that have been alive for centuries, they're there, and they're mentioned in that story. What were they doing 30 or 40 years before? And I can go on, various other characters that are in the stories. What about Professor Armitage from the Dunwich Horror when he was a much younger man? He still exists in that world. So these people could be allies, they could be villains. You have them available as people you can actually interact with straight out of the stories. They're out of the canon, but the actual stories that you and I are familiar with haven't happened yet. So maybe you're the guy that ends up going there and discovering this horrible, horrible thing. Goes on to a lot of the mythos creatures itself. Does a great job with the elder gods, the old ones, and a lot of them just don't even have stats except for a horror rating. Because if you see Yog-Sothoth or Cthulhu or Azathoth or Nyarlathotep or anything, you're coming unhinged. You have a very low chance of walking out of there a sane man or woman. And then the various creatures. There are some horrors, for lack of a better word, things like deep ones or elder things you might be able to encounter and survive. There are other creatures here that you look at their stats, you look at what they do. If you encounter something like a Shoggoth or a dimensional, I forget what it is, a dimensional shambler or a flying polyp, black spawn of Testagua, a spawn of Cthulhu, you are going to die if you actually get into a tussle with one of the things. Your best bet is to run and run very fast and hope you can outrun them. Because you just look at the mechanical representation of what these are in terms of ubiquity mechanics, and I'm laughing reading these descriptions because I'm just, I'm thinking of like our party from All for One Regime Diabolique. I know what their stats are, and those stats would translate very well into Leagues of Adventure, Leagues of Cthulhu characters. They'd all die in one round. It's awesome. And then the book ends up with a whole bunch of advice on like how to run one of these campaigns or games and make it feel like the Tales. And this is something like if you watch my channel, you know that I'm a long-term campaign guy. I like a long-term campaign. I got news for you. You run this game, you're probably not going to have a long-term campaign. Your characters are probably going to die or go mad. But that's emulation of that sort of fiction. And I really like the idea of playing in a game where maybe you will have one player character that has some elder lore, somebody that has read, one of these horrible books in Arkham University. Just like say your character in the Mountains of Madness. At the Mountains of Madness, I just love that story. But the idea they've read a little bit of that dread Necronomicon. Poor Danforth, who becomes unhinged. He's learned a little bit. He's a guy that knows a little bit of something. Most of the other people that go with him, they've never heard of all this stuff. I like the idea of having a group of player characters where maybe one person knows a little bit of that. Maybe something you read a decade ago. It's kind of forgotten. And then the other characters just have no clue about that. They're not going out to find some kind of Cthulhu mythos horror. They're going to investigate something that sounds cool in some area of the world, and then they discover things they wish that they hadn't. And just see where that game goes. So it's I really, really dig how Paul W. Wade Williams handle this. And it was something that I was wondering, like, am I going to be disappointed? Is this going to be cool or is it going to be like, okay? And I mean, I couldn't find anything wrong. It knocked it out of the park. So I cannot recommend this particular RPG supplement highly enough. This is a phenomenal piece of work. And I smiled the entire way through, just recognizing, all kinds of stuff from the Tales. Once again, 30 or 40 years before. Just my mind started to open up with all kinds of possibilities. So I want to be a player in this game. I want somebody to run this game for me and go a little mad. So that's my review of Leagues of Cthulhu, a phenomenal, phenomenal project, well worth checking out at AAA Games.